Washington State isn't suffering from a lack of money. It's suffering from a lack of restraint. Over the last several years, Olympia has taken in record revenue, expanded government faster than almost any point in state history, increased taxes, increased fees, increased regulation, and somehow still ended up staring at a multi-billion-dollar shortfall. Now they want something even bigger, a political supermajority. And if they get it, the last meaningful guardrails in this state may disappear completely. Because this isn't just about taxes anymore, it's about whether voters themselves still have the ability to stop the machine once it starts moving. Tonight we break down the push for unchecked power in Olympia and why the people funding it are the same people getting crushed by it.
From Seattle to Los Angeles, this is Left Coast News. No apologies, just the truth.
Welcome back to Left Coast News. Filing week is over. Campaign season is beginning. And quietly, underneath all the usual political slogans, one goal is becoming very clear in Olympia: total control. Not cooperation, not compromise, control. Because once one party gains a legislative supermajority, they no longer need the minority party for almost anything meaningful. And based on recent behavior in this state, that should concern every Washington resident, regardless of political affiliation. Let's start with the numbers. Washington's operating budget has nearly doubled since 2018. Doubled. Did your paycheck double? Did public safety double? Did road conditions improve dramatically? Did homelessness disappear? Did your cost of living suddenly become manageable? No. Instead, residents got some of the highest gas prices in America, some of the highest rents, rising utility costs, higher vehicle tabs, higher business costs, and a government still claiming it doesn't have enough money. That's the part they never explain. How do you go from historic tax collections to billion-dollar deficits in just a few years? The answer is simple. Government expansion became the priority. Efficiency never did. Now here's where this story becomes bigger than taxes. Olympia has increasingly used something called the emergency clause. Sounds harmless, sounds procedural. It's not. In Washington State, attaching an emergency clause to legislation can effectively block citizens from challenging the law through referendum. In plain English, the voters lose their ability to directly fight back. And we've now seen this tactic repeatedly tied to controversial legislation involving taxes and spending. The message coming out of Olympia is becoming painfully clear. If voters disagree, remove the voters from the process. And remember, Washington voters have historically rejected income taxes multiple times. Multiple times. But instead of respecting voter intent, lawmakers simply changed the packaging. First came the capital gains tax, now comes the so-called millionaire's tax. Always temporary, always limited, always only for the rich, until government spending grows again. Because government programs rarely shrink, they only hunt for the next funding source. And before anyone says, well, maybe they just need more funding, let's review the track record. Washington lost nearly $1 billion in unemployment fraud during the pandemic, one of the largest fraud failures in the country. Where were the resignations? Where was the accountability? Where are the prosecutions? Then came the King County Regional Homeless Authority chaos, budget issues, financial confusion, executive turmoil, constant restructuring, and still one of the worst visible homeless crises in the region. Billions spent, encampments still growing. Then you had the prison ombudsman scandal. Convicted felon appointed into a public oversight role in the name of second chances, only for the office itself to become wrapped in allegations of dysfunction and toxic leadership. This is the pattern. Programs expand, bureaucracies grow, accountability disappears. Taxpayers absorb the bill. And with the supermajority, there's even less incentive for internal oversight because there's less political risk. Public safety is another area where the consequences become very real. Washington has spent years layering restrictions on law enforcement while simultaneously struggling to recruit replacements. Departments across the state have faced staffing shortages. Response times have climbed. Experienced officers have retired early or left entirely. At the same time, lawmakers continue advancing increasingly aggressive firearms legislation. Magazine bans, permit proposals, expanded restrictions, additional liability measures. And here's the concern many gun owners have. If a supermajority removes the remaining political resistance in Olympia, what stops even broader restrictions from moving forward? Especially in a state where lawmakers have already shown willingness to bypass voter backlash using procedural tactics. Whether people support gun restrictions or oppose them, one thing should concern everyone. Major constitutional questions should involve robust debate and meaningful opposition, not one-party acceleration. Because rights erode faster when nobody inside government has the power to stop the momentum. Meanwhile, businesses are increasingly warning they may leave the state altogether. Why? Because employers aren't just calculating taxes anymore. They're calculating instability. Higher labor costs, higher insurance costs, higher energy costs, higher crime concerns, regulatory uncertainty, and now the possibility of even more taxation if spending continues spiraling upward. You can only squeeze the productive base of the state for so long before people start looking elsewhere. And once businesses leave, the tax base shrinks, which means government comes back to the people who stayed again. This election cycle isn't simply about left versus right. It's about whether Washington keeps any functional firewall against unchecked power. Because once a supermajority exists, compromise becomes optional. The same lawmakers who expanded taxes, bypassed referendums, oversaw massive fraud, exploded spending, and struggled to control basic public disorder will gain even fewer obstacles standing in their way. And history shows something very clearly. Government rarely limits itself voluntarily. That only happens when voters force accountability back into the system. The emergency in Washington state isn't a budget crisis. It's a government culture that increasingly believes opposition itself is the problem. That disagreement is an obstacle, that voters are something to maneuver around instead of represent. And once that mindset takes hold inside a supermajority, the guardrails disappear fast. If you made it this far, you already know the corporate media isn't going to have these conversations honestly. That's why independent channels matter now more than ever. If you want real analysis on what's happening across Washington, Oregon, and California and the rest of the country, make sure you subscribe and follow everywhere because these platforms do suppress independent reach. You can find Left Coast News and Behind the Line on YouTube, Rumble, Brighteon, BitChute, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, True Social, and Patreon. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Washington is headed toward unchecked one-party control? Or do you think these policies are moving the state in the right direction? Share this episode with someone who still thinks these problems are isolated incidents. Stay sharp. Stay aware and keep watching the West Coast, a broader institutional power issue instead of just a culture war tangent.